Toronto is supercharging its housing plan near transit, and this could be a big deal. The Ontario government and the City of Toronto just agreed to new rules to allow higher density buildings around 120 transit stations across Toronto. But a couple of key questions remain. Number one, how is this going to impact house prices for those properties that have now been upzoned? Number two, is Doug Ford trying to outdo the federal government on the housing file in a bid to push towards leadership of the federal Conservative Party? And number three, are we going to have to listen to even more whining about 15-minute cities? Let's get into it. So this is obviously a pretty big announcement. Ontario and the Toronto government are upzoning around 120 transit stations in the city of Toronto. This could enable up to 1.5 million new homes over a 25-year period. 1.5 million homes is a lot to deliver. Now, this is an expansion of Toronto's existing MTSA, or major transit station. Basically pushes for greater and greater density around transit station areas where people can walk to transit, they can walk to all of their amenities. A direct confirmation that the 15-minute city people were correct in their brilliant prediction, because why on earth would anyone want to live in walking distance to everything they need? So in plain English, many areas near subways, GO trains, and LRT stops will now allow apartment buildings where only houses stood before. The existing MTSA framework worked on a units per net residential hectare, but this is a minimum density and allows up to certain height limits and no unit restrictions. This plan functionally triples what was allowed before. So let's start with the bear case versus the bull case on what this could mean for house prices. With such massive changes to upzoning, it's worth considering the potential impact on property values. There are kind of two competing perspectives here. The first is the bull case. This would be that it could drive property values up. Transit area property values could increase significantly because properties now have dramatically higher development potential. A single family lot might now be worth a lot more as a development site for a sixplex or a small apartment building. It will increase the incentive for developers to assemble more and more of these lots to put together land assemblies for larger developments. And proximity to transit has historically commanded a bit of a premium. This would amplify that effect. Now, the bear case would say that over the long term, more supply could push house prices down. If we unlock another 1.5 million potential homes that come onto the market over the next 25 years, that's a lot of inventory, which means that unless we have sustained excess demand, which we currently don't because immigration now dropped off significantly, then that huge flood of inventory could push property values down over time. And this increased density could change neighborhood character, potentially deterring some buyers, especially in areas where it is affordable for a developer to buy one of those single family lots and convert it into a rental building, because most of this supply ends up as rental. We probably will see a bit of a push towards condos, but the City of Toronto is updating its development charge framework towards the end of this year, I think in September. And we don't know yet whether or not development charges will be waived for just rental and not condo, but that would change the dynamics quite significantly. And to, loop back in my favorite WEF commenting 15-minute city folks, if we're seeing a bigger and bigger push towards rental housing, you also get to say stuff in my comments like you'll own nothing and be happy. I already own nothing. I haven't really figured out the be happy part. So if anybody wants to let me know, that'd be great. This will move a lot of construction into those neighborhoods if developers start adopting this policy and using it to get housing built. And if every property has development potential, it dilutes the scarcity problem, which could drive down land values for development land that previously exist, therefore eventually reducing the cost structure of all new housing and pushing down the total creation costs for new supply, which should be passed on to buyers. I know a lot of people argue that, developers are greedy and they're not going to pass those savings on to buyers. I'm really sorry, but that's just not true. Maybe in a market where we have excess demand and buyers are basically willing to pay any price, but we're not in that market, and we probably won't be for, my guess is at least a decade. And so developers will reduce prices if it's going to help them get a unit sold. And right now it will help them get a unit sold. I see lots of people in my comments talking about how prices need to come down. Developers need to be willing to accept lower prices. So let me know in the comments which of these cases you think is correct. Do you think that the bull case is more likely? Is this going to push property values up? Or the bear case is more likely the excess supply is going to push property values down over time? If you want to learn everything that you can to know about multiplexes, we have an event coming up on this Thursday. If you're watching this video after Thursday, August 21st, there will be a recording available as well. We're going to have people from the city of Toronto, Brad Bradford, the planner who's on this file, a handful of really notable architects, developers, financiers in the space in the city of Toronto, all sharing their knowledge on this. So check that out. I'll put a link to the Eventbrite in the description below this video, and I hope to see you there. Okay, so now let's kind of go back and do a little bit of a history lesson. In 2022, Ontario put in something called Bill 23, and Bill 23 allowed for 3 units as of right across the province. They also wanted to make some changes to development charges, but municipalities pushed back, basically saying that they were going to have to increase property taxes if they weren't getting development charge revenue. And heaven forbid we increase property taxes in the province of Ontario. We have been subsidizing the growth of our cities, pawning those costs onto new owners in order to keep the costs for existing owners as low as we possibly can. Bill 23 also forced cities to update their transit station zoning within a year. Then Toronto came out with this program called EHON, or Expanding Housing Options in Neighborhoods. And it allowed for 4plexes as right, plus 1 ADU. So you'll often hear about this 4+1 concept in the city of Toronto. 4+1 was available as of right across neighborhoods in the city of Toronto. They also introduced the major streets, which basically allowed up to 6-story mid-rise apartments and unlocked about 31,000 potential units. And then they went a step further and took that 4plex program up to 6 units, now allowing 6plexes across the city of Toronto. There was a bunch of back and forth on it. It was originally going to be concentrated just into the downtown York and East York areas, but it's now been spread across the city with no development charges, and that hasn't been appealed or contested, and so it's likely to make it in as policy. And so both the province and the city have already been taking a handful of steps to get more density created in traditional residential neighborhoods. Now, let's take a little bit of a step back on this background. Toronto's housing crisis has historically been fueled in part by restrictive zoning, the city's yellow belt, as it's called, of single family that for decades barred multi-unit housing development in those areas. However, in recent years, policy changes at both the provincial and city level have started chipping away at those old rules. And I think that this restrictive zoning is one of the big reasons why people like single family detached in the city of Toronto. They were very much suburban neighborhoods within a city. And you don't have a lot of cities around the world that are like that. And these policy changes, whether you like it or not, if we're assuming that the market and the consumer likes those single family detached for that reason, because they don't have to live around a bunch of dens and they can still walk to the Danforth or whatever, this is a little bit of an erosion of that appeal. It's going to start taking away some of that appeal, and that could just impact the demand for these property types in general. And this is where a lot of NIMBYism comes from, right? People saying, yeah, you can build these things, just not in my backyard because it's going to impact my property values, or I don't want all of this type of housing around me, or whatever. Now, let's also go over major transit station areas. When you hear this policy, they make it sound like it's kind of radial. So you're basically drawing a circle around a transit station, and anything within that circle has now been upzoned. But that's not actually the case. There are these existing polygons that have been drawn on the map in the major transit station areas. You can see them all here. And if you just Google Toronto major transit station areas, there's actually a dashboard that you can use on the City of Toronto website where you can click through every subway station by name and actually see the major transit station area that's around that subway station. And it'll also show you, and these haven't been updated, but the planned density, estimated density as it stands right now, provincial minimum density, and then the planned density in the future, and the proposed maximum density. Now, if you just want to learn what density you can get on your site, like literally just take your property, put in the address, punch in the width and depth of your lot, go to ownerplex.ca and scroll down, click on Get My Estimate, and literally just type in your address, and it'll spit out a GFA, gross floor area, of what you can actually build on your property. In instance, it uses AI to basically do calculations. It might ask you a couple of other questions. On top of that, you have the PMTSA, which is a protected MTSA, and this is the official designation approved by the province. This locks in even higher density and minimum density targets. So if you decide you want to develop your property in one of these areas, you have to hit a minimum density target. And this makes it harder for those NIMBY appeals I mentioned to block development. It can also apply inclusionary zoning or affordable housing rules. Now, what does this whole thing mean? The Ontario government just approved Toronto's official plan amendment 570, which establishes 49 transit station areas as PMTSAs. with more expected to come. This decision essentially turbocharges the zoning around these stations. It pushes for more and more density around these transit stations in these areas. The remaining transit stations, there's about 14 of them, are under review or deferred, but the goal is to cover roughly 120 stations in total. So why is this even an upgrade? Until now, Toronto's MTSA plans were largely aspirational, and they might continue to be because the economics of developing in Toronto are not exceptionally good right now. City Council had endorsed them, but the zoning on the ground, the actual code that developers have to abide by, was still mostly the old single family and low density housing. But with this provincial approval, the official plan now mandates greater height and density around these stations, with up to 4 stories in residential areas, 6 stories on all major streets, and in some cases, even as high as 30 stories. So what's actually new here? Like, what can be built? The new rules vary by how close to the station you are, but here are the broad strokes. 6-story apartments on residential streets. Within about 200 meters of a transit station, you can now build up to a 6-story apartment building, even on a site that's not on a major road. Previously, those interior neighborhood lots were limited to houses or at most a 4-plex and then a 6-plex. Now a 3-story walk-up can become a 6-story mid-rise by right if it's very close to the station. This means that those single-family homes immediately around subway or GO stations could gradually turn into low-rise apartments without needing special rezoning. One of the champions of getting rid of the Yellow Belt in the city of Toronto, Sean Galbraith, noted this change, saying that 6-story apartment buildings are now permitted in neighborhoods within 200 meters of transit stations, even when they are not on a major street. Even beyond the 200-meter zone, this plan allows increased height. If a property fronts onto a major street within the MTSA, it can also likely go up to 6 stories under these new permissions, similar to the city's earlier major streets initiative, which is currently under appeal, but it's under appeal for positive reasons, so it'll likely get passed. For properties further out, say 500 to 800 meters from the station and not on a main road, expect something like 4-story apartments to be allowed as of right. In short, the entire 10-minute walk shed around this station is being upzoned. Taller buildings near the station, gentle mid-rise in the outer part of that transit area. The exact heights and density will depend on the station's context, but generally no more single-family exclusivity in those areas around transit stations. Now, the news headline is 30-story buildings near transit, and indeed some station areas in the new plan are allowed to have taller buildings than before. Many of these stations are in places that already anticipated growth, for example, locations downtown or at major intersections, and the province's approval locked in those higher maximum heights. But it's interesting because when I posted a lot of this, I had a developer reach out to me. I talked to and work with a lot of developers in the GTA, and I had a developer reach out to me and basically say, we actually just had the city reduce our zoning in a major transit station area for a high density project. And so they're pushing more and more density in these low density environments, but less and less density in these higher density environments. So are we seeing a shift away from the last 10 to 20 years of construction where it was primarily concrete high rise and a push more and more towards these smaller density concepts and missing middle style development? Now, perhaps the most revolutionary change is simply allowing apartment uses in areas long zoned for houses. The station area frameworks redesignate some residential lands so that multiplexes and apartments are now permitted within lands previously designated neighborhoods. Now, this opens up a lot of new opportunities for small-scale developers and even homeowners. You could potentially replace a single-family house with small apartment building legally. And there's a lot of those legacy landowners that own a lot of single-family housing in the city of Toronto that could now start pushing into maybe partnering with a developer or hiring a developer and capitalizing on the value that's locked in their land. And because this is as of right, the process should be faster and more predictable than a traditional rezoning fight. So in summary, if you live near a transit stop, the development potential of your property just increased dramatically. The city estimates these changes could create eventually 1.5 million homes. Will it all get built overnight? Probably not. They have a 25-year vision for it. But it does mean the door is open to a huge amount of mid-rise housing construction that was previously illegal. Now, the irony is not lost on me that we are focusing on transit-oriented development in the city of Toronto when we think about Toronto's subway station system and what it looked like in 2010 versus Chengdu, China, and what Toronto's transit station looks like in 2024 versus Chengdu, China. And I could use, obviously this is a bit of a extreme example because Chengdu is a massive city in China, but by and large, Toronto is really behind when it comes to infrastructure, especially transit infrastructure. And I do think that we will see a lot of pushes to ramp up construction of transit and transit infrastructure, especially if the city wants to enforce its return to office mandates, which I just did a video on, and I encourage you to check it out. I'll put it in the card at the end of the video. Toronto already has some of the worst traffic in the world. We're typically in the top 100 worst cities in the world when it comes to traffic. And so you kind of end up with a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Like we don't have transit as robust as we need it. And so we're forced to cram density into this limited transit framework that we have. This all matters because it adds housing supply near transit. It supports walkability and that very conspiratorial 15-minute city vision. And a lot of this is because multiplexes and a lot of these density concepts that are being proposed, they're on very small lots. They typically have very poor parking. If you want to develop a property with underground parking, it increases the build cost substantially. You have to excavate, you have to shore, you have to put in a huge waterproofing system. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to happen to put underground parking in. And so a lot of these concepts aren't proposing underground parking, and they're actually no parking minimums for a lot of these projects. And the idea is that that's fine near transit. And I really think that this is going to matter less and less as the world pushes towards things like Tesla robo-taxis. You know, San Francisco and Las Vegas, you have Waymos, like literally robots driving people everywhere. Tesla robo-taxis are going to have a similar impact. This is basically like a decentralized transit network that can take people all over the city. Now let's take a look at this from the political angle. We can't end this video without touching on the politics behind this thing. Obviously, Pierre Poilievre just had a huge election upset, losing to Mark Carney. Housing affordability has been the hot button issue across Canada, and every level of government wants to claim that they're taking action on it. And Premier Doug Ford, Ontario's leader, has made housing construction a signature issue, setting ambitious province-wide targets of 1.5 million homes by 2031. By pushing through big zoning changes like this Toronto Transit upzoning and the earlier Bill 23 reforms, Ford is certainly trying to show results. Some observers see this as Ford trying to outdo the federal government on housing. There's even speculation that it's a bit of a power play. By leapfrogging ahead with Ontario's own aggressive measures, Doug Ford can say, look, we Conservatives in Ontario are actually getting housing built, not just talking about it. It might be positioning for a future narrative, or who knows, maybe, and this is becoming less and less of a maybe every day because, you know, most political commentators are now speculating with headlines saying, will Poilievre versus Ford define the CPC leadership review? And there's a lot of speculation that Ford has an eye on federal politics down the line. He denies it, but these moves certainly boost his profile. Ford seems to be aligning himself more and more with other politicians. Ford's housing minister standing together with Toronto's Mayor Chow, touting this cooperative approach is a far cry from the fights that we saw between all three levels of government of the past. It is an interesting alliance, right? A progressive conservative premier, and I think a lot of people would argue that Doug's not actually a conservative, and I would probably agree with that from a political definition perspective. A very NDP mayor finding common ground, largely because the housing crisis has become impossible to ignore. And of course, everyone's trying to claim credit. The province made sure to note that the former, more modest city plan would only have created 500,000 homes, whereas their approved plan enables 1.5 million. And in typical political fashion, the whole thing's just a game of one-upmanship. Meanwhile, the feds have recently floated updated incentive programs for municipalities to upzone around transit.
Here's what I found.
But Doug Ford's essentially saying we're not waiting around for the Fed or the municipalities to get this. And so it's a bit of a race to be the housing hero in Canada. And frankly, if it yields more homes, I think that that's a great outcome. If it helps create housing affordability, also known as reduce house prices, sorry, but somebody had to say it, then let them try to outdo each other. For us citizens and would-be home builders, what matters is that the rules of the game are changing. If you've been frustrated that you can't afford a home or that your community never builds anything but condos and detached houses, well, things are finally evolving. It is now legal to build the missing middle almost everywhere near transit in Toronto. It is a big paradigm shift from the city of old. We've gone from a city where vast neighborhoods were frozen in time to one where the only constant is change, especially if you live near a bus, streetcar, train, or subway line. It's an exciting time for urbanists, yes, and it's going to be chaotic for those who live in those areas or for those who like things to stay the way that they are. But remember, vibrant neighborhoods, Kensington Market, the Annex, Leslieville, you name it, often started as gentle density experiments of their era. Some of the most famous cities around the world, like Copenhagen or Paris, are all missing middle cities. They were built in a period of time where our construction engineering only allowed us to build buildings of that size when the Eiffel Tower was a marvel of construction. And so the houses of yesterday were being duplexed and triplexed. Now we're simply continuing that evolution for the 21st century. I mean, one of the most famous urbanists of all time, a lady by the name of Jane Jacobs, was obsessed with Toronto's annex neighborhood because of the way that it did these things. Now, here's my call to action for you. If all of this talk of multiplexes, sixplexes, and transit-oriented development has you thinking, how can I get in on that? You're not alone. There are a lot of opportunities here for homeowners, for investors, and for builders to create more housing and, yes, profit ethically while doing so. Maybe you own a home near a transit station, or you're considering adding units, or maybe you want to buy and develop a multiplex property. To help you navigate this, we are launching a multiplex masterclass, an in-depth course in collaboration with a leading Toronto multiplex developer. It will cover everything from planning and design to permits and financing to the nitty-gritty of construction for multi-unit houses in Toronto. If you want to learn how to take a single-family residential lot and convert it into a cash-flowing multiplex or apartment building, this is for you. This course will give you the tools and knowledge to succeed in this new landscape of housing. So click the link in the description or visit our website to learn more and sign up for the Multiplex Masterclass. Seats are limited because we want this to be an interactive and in-depth experience with our expert instructors, so don't miss out. And thank you for taking the time to watch this today. If you found this informative, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content on housing and urban development. I also cover economics and what's happening with house prices. And let me know your thoughts and comments on all of this. I read all my comments. I try and respond to all of them. There's a lot of 15-minute city folks in there. Just so you're aware, I don't live in a city. I like living in a rural area. So I get where you're coming from, but I don't really take it away from other people. Live and let live, as they say. Do you think this is going to be bullish for house prices? Does this push single family home values up in the city of Toronto because they now are all development sites? Or will this flood of supply push prices down in the fullness of time? Curious to get your take. As always, I really love the discussions in the comments, so let's continue the discussion there. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this video. I really appreciate it. It honestly means the world to me, and I'll get you another video as soon as I can. I think the next thing I'm going to cover actually is whether or not the increase in the CMHC cutoff from 1 million to 1.5 million has even accomplished anything. So stay tuned for that one.